The CEO laughed when the single dad bought 50 junk cars, then one change everything. Mason Carter was not a reckless man. He was the kind of man who carried the weight of a bank loan, overdue bills, and a future that had gone dark after his wife walked out. But when he emptied every dollar of his savings, $18,000, everything he had, to buy 50 junked cars from a demolition yard, CEO Jackson Hale laughed out loud in front of his board. "That man is finished," Jackson said. No one knew that car number 23 in that scrap pile was quietly waiting to bring down Jackson's empire and change Mason's life forever. Keep listening to find out what secret hidden inside that rusted car forced a powerful CEO to bow his head. At 38 years old, Mason Carter had the kind of hands that told his story before he ever opened his mouth. The palms were calloused, the knuckles permanently lined with engine grease that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. And the grip was the grip of a man who had spent 2 decades working on machines most people could not name. He had put in 11 years at Hale Automotive, one of the 3 largest automotive conglomerates on the eastern seaboard, working his way from junior technician to senior mechanical engineer in the company's maintenance division. 3 consecutive years the division had handed him the top performance award, though he never displayed the plaques. They sat in a box under his workbench, not out of false modesty, but because being good at what he did was simply what he expected of himself. His colleagues said he was the best listener in the building, not because he said much, but because he could crouch beside a running engine and hear what was wrong with it the way a doctor hears a failing heartbeat. Quietly, precisely, without hesitation. The house in Columbus was a rental, a 2-bedroom off Route 40 with good bones and a leaky roof the landlord promised to fix each spring and never did. Mason had shared it with his wife Eleanor for 6 years. Then, 14 months before any of this began, Eleanor left. She packed 2 bags, set the keys on the kitchen counter, and drove north toward a life Mason apparently could not fit into. She left behind $23,000 in joint credit card debt and a silence so complete, it seemed to have a weight and a temperature of its own. Mason paid the bills. He arrived at work each morning at 10 minutes to 7. He ate lunch in the break room, drove home in the evening, and maintained the kind of steady, relentless routine that functions as armor when everything else has been stripped away. He had gray-blue eyes that always looked like they were running a calculation, and in the months after Eleanor left, that quality only deepened. He asked nothing of the world beyond the next task, and the world, for a time, gave him that much and nothing more. Logan Webb had known Mason since the winter they had both gone looking for work at the same machine shop on the south side, a cold, oily place where neither of them lasted longer than 8 months, but enough time for a friendship to form that neither man felt the need to explain or examine. Logan was 41, broad-shouldered and plain-spoken, the kind of man who said what he thought and rarely regretted it. He ran a side business out of a rented lot on the western edge of the city, buying damaged vehicles on weekends and reselling them once he had coaxed them back to functional life. He was not wealthy, he was not ambitious in the way that showed, but he was reliable in the particular way that very few people manage to be, the kind of reliable that does not require conditions, and when Mason needed someone, Logan was the first call and the first to answer. He carried a pair of old locking pliers in the breast pocket of his jacket everywhere he went, rusted at the hinge and wrapped in electrical tape at the grip, left to him by his father the year the old man died. He had never explained why he kept them close. He didn't need to. Diana Lawson entered Mason's awareness quietly, the way things that matter often do. She was 35 years old and worked in Hale Automotive's legal compliance division, a role that suited the particular combination of her temperament and her training. She read people, the way other lawyers read contracts, carefully and between the lines, with attention to what was being omitted. She had seen Mason once before the evening she found him in the parking structure. He had presented a proposal in a division improvement meeting, a complete redesign of the company's parts recycling process that, by her own rough estimation, would have saved the company $2 million annually. The proposal had been credited in the follow-up memo to a vice president who had not been in the original meeting. Mason had said nothing about it publicly, and the fact that he had said nothing was the thing Diana found herself returning to, more than once without fully understanding why. The evening she came across him crouched under a coworker's car with a flashlight and nothing else, Running a diagnosis in the dim of a parking garage after 9 at night, she stopped and asked whether he worried what people thought. He said he was used to it. She turned that answer over on the drive home, and it stayed with her longer than it had any particular reason to. The week that broke the routine began on a Monday and did not let up. Mason arrived at work to find a memo on every desk in the maintenance division, a single page, announcing that the department's operations were being outsourced to a third-party contractor, effective in 60 days. 23 positions, including Mason's, would be eliminated. Management expressed appreciation for everyone's years of service. By Wednesday, a third payment reminder arrived from the bank on the outstanding credit balance. Mason sat in his car in the company parking lot after his shift that evening with the engine off, and did not move for the better part of an hour. He watched the lights in the building go dark floor by floor. He did not know exactly what he was waiting for. He was, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, genuinely without an answer. Logan called at 9:15. Mason answered and said nothing for a while. Logan said nothing in return. He understood the geography of Mason's silences well enough to know when one needed to be left alone and when it needed to be interrupted. After a long pause, Logan said that what Mason needed was not sympathy but a plan. Mason agreed. They agreed on that much. The idea that came to Mason in the days that followed did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as memory, something his father had done for 30 years out of a garage on the east side of Detroit. Finding broken vehicles for almost nothing, rebuilding them well enough to sell, and surviving on the margin between the two. His father had possessed the same quality Mason had inherited, the ability to hear what a machine was actually communicating, and he had built an entire livelihood around it without ever calling it a skill. Mason spent 3 evenings that week running the research, salvage and parts resale, independent shop supply networks, regional pricing structures. What he found was that the used auto parts market in the United States was valued at more than $32 billion annually, and that independent repair shops were increasingly seeking alternatives to major distributors, whose prices climbed every year regardless of demand. He found the Garrett & Sons listing on a Thursday night. Wyatt Garrett, 68 years old and in poor health, was liquidating his entire Dayton-based salvage yard inventory, 50 vehicles of varying make, model, and condition available as a single lot for $18,000. Mason laid the plan out for Logan over the phone, purchased the lot, dismantle the vehicles systematically, and sell directly to independent shops through online platforms and a regional network he would build himself. Logan listened to all of it before pointing out that Mason had no facility, no workforce beyond himself, and that $18,000 was the entirety of what stood between him and a financial position that could not be corrected. Mason said he was aware of all of that. Logan asked what happened if he was wrong. Mason said being wrong about this was not meaningfully worse than where he already was. Logan was quiet for a moment, then said fine, but if it went sideways, he was going to exercise his right to say nothing at all, which was, coming from Logan, a significant concession. Mason drove to Dayton on a Friday morning, 45 minutes on an empty highway. Wyatt Garrett met him in a small office overlooking rows of vehicles in varying states of decomposition, a lean man with clear eyes and the measured attentiveness of someone who had been buying and selling metal long enough to identify the difference between a person who understood what they were getting into and one who was pretending. He asked Mason directly whether he knew what he was buying. Mason said not entirely, but that he would figure it out. Wyatt held his gaze for a few seconds, then laughed in the quiet way of a man who has seen enough of both kinds of people to find one more refreshing than the other. The contract was signed, the wire transfer cleared. Mason drove home with $47 in his account and a receipt for 50 cars. The information spread through Hale Automotive the way workplace gossip always does, not through official channels, but through the particular invisible infrastructure of break rooms, parking lot conversations, and messages sent during meetings that were supposed to be about something else. Adrian Cole, a 29-year-old accounts processing clerk with a cultivated interest in other people's business, had noticed the searches on a shared internal terminal and mentioned it to someone, who mentioned it to someone else, and within 48 hours the story had been refined through several retellings into something more colorful than the original facts. A maintenance worker had spent his entire life savings on 50 rusted cars he apparently planned to turn into a business. The response across the office ranged from mild pity to outright amusement. Jackson Hale held his monthly leadership meeting on the first Thursday of every month in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, a space designed to communicate authority through its sightlines alone, the Columbus skyline on one side, 12 people whose collective decisions ran the company seated around a long mahogany table on the other. Jackson was 52 years old, the son of the man who had built Hale Automotive from a regional parts distributor into a multi-state manufacturing and sales operation. He wore his suits in deep navy, had them made by a tailor in Baltimore, and communicated in a manner that left very little room for interpretation. He was not a careless man, he was a precise one, and precision, applied at sufficient scale and for sufficient time, sometimes arrives at conclusions that look like indifference from a different angle. Sebastian Cross was 45, a vice president of strategic planning who had learned over 12 years with the company that one of the most reliable ways to remain in good standing with the man at the top was to provide something useful in the moments between agenda items. Toward the end of the Thursday meeting, Sebastian mentioned Mason Carter's situation the way one might share an item of local color, malicious, but not careful. A mechanic in maintenance, he said, had received his termination notice and responded by spending his last $18,000 on 50 derelict vehicles he intended to resell for parts. The room responded the way rooms respond to unexpected absurdity. Jackson set his pen down, looked up and laughed, not the polite laughter of a man acknowledging someone else's humor, but real laughter, unrehearsed and brief. The observation that followed was delivered with the ease of complete certainty. A man who lacked the judgment to hold on to money, Jackson said, lacked the judgment to do anything useful with a pile of scrap. He would be gone in 6 months. The meeting moved on. Diana Lawson did not laugh. She was seated at the far end of the table with a legal pad, present in her capacity as compliance advisor, and she had written nothing in the margin beside the story of Mason Carter. But she had noticed the ease of it, the way the room had followed Jackson's lead without a pause, the absence of any curiosity about what circumstances had produced a senior employee's decision. She noticed, and she did not let go of it. When Logan relayed the story to Mason that evening, Mason listened to all of it before asking one question. 6 months, Logan said yes. Mason said that was fine and hung up. He did not pace the floor. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface, then rose, found a black marker in the drawer beneath the stove, and wrote 2 words on a sheet of paper. He taped it to the wall above the kitchen window. It read, 6 months. He drew a circle around it. He went to bed. Diana found him 2 days later under the pretext of a compliance question, told him directly that she had been in the room and waited. He said he knew. She asked whether he wanted to know what had been said. He told her that the more important fact was that she was standing in front of him saying anything at all. She did not respond immediately, and she did not leave. The 50 vehicles arrived over 2 days in a rented flatbed arrangement Logan had organized, through a contact, and the borrowed lot on the western edge of the city became the operation's physical foundation. A rectangle of cracked asphalt with a single corrugated steel shed at one end that held the tools. Mason had resigned from Hale Automotive on the final day of his notice period without drama, a signed form and a handshake at the HR desk. He had $47, he had 50 cars. He had 2 months of rent before the arithmetic would begin working against him in ways that could not be absorbed. The first 2 weeks were harder than he had calculated, and he had calculated them to be hard. He worked from 5 in the morning until well past dark, dividing his hours between systematic disassembly and the separate work of photographing, cataloging, and listing parts across 3 online platforms. Logan came on weekends, arriving early and staying until the light failed. They worked in the particular silence of 2 men who did not need to talk to be useful to each other, with a battery-powered radio filling the space that conversation would have occupied. By the end of the 14th day, Mason had generated $2,300 in revenue, enough for a month's rent, nothing beyond that. The shift came in the 3rd week. Mason stepped back far enough from the day-to-day mechanics to look at who was buying from him and why. It was not individual mechanics or hobbyists driving the numbers. It was small and mid-sized independent repair shops whose owners were facing the same structural problem: distributor prices that climbed annually, margins that did not, and no leverage to change either. Mason reached out directly to 15 independent shops within 100 miles, calling each owner personally and offering a direct supply arrangement. Quality used parts at 30 to 40% below market rate. On a standing agreement rather than a one-off basis, 7 agreed to try it. He tracked the inventory by hand on a spreadsheet. Week 3 revenue, $4,100. For the first time since he had signed in Dayton, he could see something that resembled a forward direction. Diana began appearing at the lot in a way that gradually stopped requiring justification. She understood quickly that she could not contribute to the mechanical work and did not attempt to. What she did instead was review the supply contracts Mason had drafted in his own imprecise legal language and identify the points that exposed him to disputes he had not anticipated. She rewrote 3 of them over 2 evenings at the fold-out table in the shed. Logan watched her without comment for most of that time, then told Mason afterward that he had a person considerably more competent than himself working, without compensation, and that he ought to think about that. Mason said he knew. Logan asked what he planned to do about it. Mason said he was not sure yet, but that he did not intend to waste it. The setback arrived in the 5th week. 2 of the 7 partner shops called within 3 days of each other to cancel their arrangements, both citing distributor pressure, both offering apologies that stopped short of specifics. The timing was not consistent with coincidence. Logan was openly frustrated about it in the kinetic way he was frustrated about most things. Mason spent an extra hour alone in the lot that evening, standing among the remaining vehicles in the dark, before walking back to the shed and continuing. Diana tracked the connection a week later through her access to internal communications at Hale. Sebastian Cross was serving as an informal consultant to the company's regional distribution arm, and the pressure applied to Mason's partner shops aligned precisely with the distribution review meeting Cross had attended. She told Mason what she had found. He listened, asked whether she was comfortable with what she now knew. She said she had known longer than he realized. He let that sit, then he went back to work. It was a Friday evening in the 6th week when Mason found it. Logan had called ahead to say he could not come, a family obligation that could not be moved, and Mason had worked alone through the afternoon and into the early dark, moving methodically through the vehicles that remained on the lot. The radio was off. The shed lamp threw a long rectangle of yellow light across the asphalt, and beyond that edge everything was the particular blackness of a city's outskirts in winter. The sounds were only metal and tools. Car number 23 was a 2019 Ford F-150 that had come through a collision hard enough to buckle the driver's side frame rail and push the rear quarter panel 3 inches out of alignment. From any angle it read as straightforward scrap, a seized engine, body damage beyond economic repair. Mason had earmarked it for parts removal earlier in the week and had not gotten to it until now. He started at the exterior passenger door mirror housing, the undamaged trim along the driver's side. Then he moved to the electrical components beneath the dashboard, standard work. The kind his hands could do while his mind ran logistics for the following day. He was in the cargo bed, working at the floor panel to access the frame components beneath it, when his fingers found something that did not belong. Not a structural irregularity, not a manufacturing artifact, a pouch, flat rectangular ripstop nylon, pressed flush against the underside of a welded crossmember and secured with 2 cable ties that had been clipped and retied with deliberate care. It had not been left there by accident. Mason sat back on his heels in the dark truck bed and looked at what he was holding. He thought for a moment about setting it down and continuing with the disassembly. Instead, he carried it to the shed, sat on the stool beside the work table, and opened it under the lamp. Inside was a sealed paper envelope and a USB drive sealed in a small plastic bag. He opened the envelope first. 3 pages, 2 were handwritten on ruled paper dense with dates, names and dollar figures arranged in a sequence that took him several passes to parse. The 3rd page was a printed photograph, a screenshot of an email chain, time-stamped across 2 days in March of 2021, bearing in the header the name and executive title of Jackson Hale. The email chain discussed, in the clipped and deliberate language of men who did not wish to be understood by anyone outside, the exchange a decision to prevent the filing of a patent application. The technology in question was a fuel efficiency system for commercial-grade engines, a system capable, according to an attached internal feasibility assessment, of reducing fuel consumption by 19% across a standard duty cycle. The name attached to its development was Elijah Wren. Mason read the pages twice, then read them a third time at half speed. He understood what he was looking at. The feasibility assessment showed projections that would have made the patent commercially significant enough to create a direct conflict with a $400 million engine supply contract that Hale Automotive had finalized with a commercial fleet consortium 6 months before the email chain was dated. The technology would have made that contract's underlying product category economically obsolete. So the technology had been buried. The engineer who developed it had been removed in a division restructuring 8 months later. And the car that eventually held the evidence of all of it had ended up in a salvage yard in Dayton for $18,000. Mason called Logan at 11 minutes past 11. Logan answered on the second ring. Mason said he needed Logan to come to the lot. Logan said it was past 11. Mason said he was aware of that. A pause, then Logan said he was on his way. He arrived 22 minutes later, still in the jacket from wherever he had been. He sat on the second stool and read the 3 pages under the lamp without speaking. When he finished, he set them down carefully on the table and was quiet for longer than Mason had ever seen him stay quiet. Then Logan asked if Mason knew what he had. Mason said it was not about that. Logan asked what it was about then. Mason was quiet for a moment, looking out through the open shed door at the 28 remaining vehicles in the dark. He said it was about the truth and about what a person did with it once they had it. Logan did not push further. They sat with that. And in a corrugated steel shed on the edge of Columbus, with a folding table and a rusted lamp between them, what had begun as a desperate financial decision quietly became something else entirely. Finding Elijah Wren required 3 days and a combination of methods Mason and Logan could not have described as a coherent strategy. They worked through engineering forums, a regional mechanical association's public membership directory, and a contact Logan had at a trade school in Akron who knew people in the field. What they found was a man who had not disappeared but had retreated, 49 years old, teaching part-time at a technical college in Cleveland, living quietly in a way that suggested someone who had concluded the world had already returned its verdict on a certain matter and had learned, if not to accept it, then to function in its presence. The meeting happened in a diner off the interstate, halfway between Columbus and Cleveland. Elijah Wren was already seated when Mason arrived, a lean man with gray coming in at his temples, and an alertness in his eyes that was at odds with the composed stillness of the rest of him. He had chosen a table at the back facing the entrance. He was drinking black coffee and did not reach for the menu. Mason set the envelope on the table without preamble. Elijah looked at it without touching it for a long moment, then looked at Mason, then looked back at the envelope. He said quietly that he had wondered who would find it. What followed was not a conversation of anger or grievance. Elijah described what had happened in the flat and precise tone of an engineer describing a system. Failure, here is the sequence. Here is the point at which it broke. He had developed the technology over 2 years, documented it thoroughly, and submitted it for patent consideration through the company's internal channels. The response had been non-committal, then delayed, then silent. He had asked questions and been told they had been referred upward. 8 months after submission, he was included in a division-wide restructuring that eliminated his role. When he subsequently attempted to pursue the patent independently, the concept was his, though the development had occurred on company time and equipment, creating significant legal complexity. He found that the resources required to contest the company's position exceeded what he had available. He had kept the documentation because he did not know what else to do with it. He had sealed it in the truck on the day he sold it because he had not wanted it in his home and had not been ready to destroy it. He said this without sentiment, the way someone describes a decision made under conditions they no longer fully recognize as their own. Mason told him what he intended to do. Elijah listened without interrupting. When Mason finished, the older man looked at his coffee cup for a while. Then he said, "All right." Mason brought Diana into it that same evening. He told her everything without selection or softening. She listened with her hands flat on the table, made no notes, and when he finished asked one question: what did he want to do with it? He said he wanted the patent filed under Elijah's name, without conditions, and the record corrected. Diana said that was a long and expensive legal fight. Mason said he knew and that he was not doing it alone. Something in her expression shifted, a small thing, the kind that only registers if you are already paying attention. She called Grace Caldwell the following morning. Grace was 38, a former federal intellectual property litigator who had left a large firm to open a practice focused specifically on patent suppression and wrongful appropriation cases. She was the kind of lawyer who was sought out by people who had been told their case was unwinnable, which was the only category she had ever found genuinely interesting. She reviewed the documentation over 2 days. Her written summary used the word significant 3 times in a single paragraph, which, for a woman who used language with the economy of a contract, communicated something of substance. The USB drive, however, was encrypted. Elijah remembered the password, the birthday of a son he had not spoken to since his divorce. A date he had not expected to use for anything at all. The data the drive contained was more complete than the printed pages had suggested. Internal communications, financial modeling, feasibility reports, and meeting notes from the precise period in which the decision to suppress the filing had been made. Meanwhile, a letter from a Hale automotive attorney arrived at Mason's rental address, vague in its specific allegations, clear in its intent to create unease. He forwarded it to Grace. She read it, set it down, and said that companies filed letters like this when they were afraid. She said the appropriate response was to continue. Grace Caldwell filed the formal complaint with the United States Patent and Trademark Office and simultaneously initiated civil proceedings against Hale Automotive in the Southern District of Ohio on a Thursday morning. By that afternoon, a financial journalist who covered the automotive sector had received an anonymous communication and had begun calling the company's press office. Hale Automotive's stock dropped 4.5% in the following morning's session. The board of directors convened an emergency call before noon. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Jackson Hale had, for the first time in his career, spoken Mason Carter's name. 2 days later, Mason received a call from a number he did not recognize. A voice told him that Mr. Hale wished to meet at 9 o'clock the following morning, privately on the 14th floor. Mason said he would be there. Logan told him to take Grace. Diana told him to take Grace. Grace herself told him to take Grace. Mason listened to all 3 of them, thanked them, and went alone. He could not fully explain the decision to anyone, including himself. He had learned over the preceding 2 months that the right action was not always the one that made the most sense from the outside, and this felt like one of those moments where the logic lived somewhere other than the argument. The 14th floor office was everything the rest of the building's common spaces worked toward, being wide windows, quiet carpet, a desk of dark-stained oak without a single object out of place. Jackson Hale was standing when Mason came in. It was a small thing. Most men in his position would have remained seated. The first thing Jackson said was whether Mason had found what he was looking for. Mason said he had not been looking for anything. He had bought 50 cars. Jackson moved to the chair behind the desk and gestured to the chair across from it. Jackson made his offer without decoration. Elijah Wren would receive a settlement in exchange for the withdrawal of all filings and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. Mason would receive a sum described as generous, with the same conditions attached. The litigation would be resolved privately. Mason listened to all of it before he responded. He asked whether Jackson remembered what he had said in the leadership meeting 6 months ago. Jackson said it had been a professional assessment, not a personal one. Mason said that distinction worked differently depending on which side of it you were on. He reached into the folder he had brought and placed a single page on the desk between them. It was not a counteroffer in the traditional sense. It was a list. First, Elijah Wren's name on the patent publicly, without conditions and without a non-disclosure agreement. Second, a scholarship fund in Elijah's name at the technical college where he taught, seated with a minimum of $500,000 and endowed in perpetuity. Third, the immediate cessation of any pressure, direct or through intermediaries, on Mason's business and his partner shops. Fourth, a personal apology from Jackson Hale to Elijah Wren, not a press statement. not a communication drafted by the company's communications team, a direct conversation, private, between the two of them, in which Jackson said what needed to be said. Jackson read the page once at normal speed and then again more slowly. The room held the particular quality of silence that Mason had not experienced since the night he sat in the parking lot watching the building go dark. He did not fill it. He watched Jackson read and waited. When Jackson looked up, he asked what Mason wanted for himself. Mason said he wanted to never need to sit in this office again. And he wanted Jackson to know that the man he had dismissed in front of a room full of people 6 months ago was sitting across from him now on equal terms, and that Jackson understood the reason why. Jackson Hale looked at Mason Carter with the focused attention of a man who has spent his career reading people as assets or liabilities and who is discovering, in this specific instance, that the calculation he had made was wrong. He was quiet for 90 seconds. Mason counted without intending to, the way one counts when the silence has a weight. Then Jackson picked up the page from the desk. He held it for a moment, set it down. He reached across the desk and extended his hand. Mason looked at the hand. He looked at Jackson's face. He shook it firmly without smiling, without saying anything further. He picked up his folder, stood, walked to the door, and pressed the elevator button. When the doors opened, he stepped inside. When they closed, he leaned his back against the wall and closed his eyes, not from exhaustion. From the specific sensation of something that has been true for a long time finally being acknowledged by the people who had the power to deny it. The patent was formally registered under the name Elijah Wren 4 months after the filing, in a process Grace Caldwell later described as considerably smoother than average for contested matters, a reflection, she noted without elaborating, of what occurs when the opposing party elects cooperation over continuation. The scholarship fund was established within 6 weeks of the agreement being signed, endowed in Elijah's name, the first cohort of recipients selected by the faculty of the Technical College's Mechanical Engineering program. The announcement ceremony was small, a conference room at the college, roughly 40 people, most of them students or colleagues. Elijah stood at the front of the room with the patent certificate in his hands. His hands were not entirely steady. He found Mason at the back of the room near the door and nodded once. Mason nodded in return. Nothing more was necessary. 3 weeks after the ceremony, on a Tuesday evening, Elijah called a phone number he had not dialed in 4 years. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. He did not tell anyone about it for some time. The business Mason and Logan had built from the 50 cars did not transform into something unrecognizable. It grew the way that honest work grows, incrementally through reputation, through the slow accumulation of relationships with people who found that Mason did what he said he would do. By the end of the 5th month from the purchase date, Mason had moved through the majority of the inventory and generated gross revenue of $67,400. After costs, the net was $41,200, enough to clear the remaining debt and retain $19,000 as working capital. He and Logan formalized the partnership, not an enterprise with ambitions towards scale for its own sake, but a company with a specific function and a particular standard at its center. A regional chain of independent shops in Cincinnati placed the first volume order. 2 additional employees were brought on before the year ended. The work was what it had always been, finding value in what other people had given up on, and doing it well enough to matter. Diana Lawson resigned from Hale Automotive 3 weeks after the agreement was signed. Her letter was 1 paragraph. She joined Grace Caldwell's practice as in-house legal advisor, a role suited to someone who understood both the internal logic of large organizations and the formal language used to hold them to account. She and Mason did not move quickly toward anything, which was perhaps the most honest thing about it. They existed in each other's days in ways that increased gradually and without announcement. She came to the lot one weekend afternoon with a cup of coffee and sat on the step at the entrance to the shed, watching Logan and Mason work. She did not explain why she was there, and no one asked. Sebastian Cross was reassigned to a role in Hale Automotive's Administrative Compliance Division, a position that carried no operational authority and involved no consequential decisions. The announcement was made internally without commentary. Jackson Hale continued to lead the company. He was not ruined, he was not publicly disgraced. The board required the formation of an independent ethics oversight committee with genuine, operational authority, and the requirement was met. In the leadership meeting the following month, when a vice president began to make a passing remark about a junior employee's recent decisions, Jackson raised his hand and said they had a full agenda and should continue. No one understood the reason. He was the only person in the room who did. 6 months after signing his name in a small office in Dayton, Mason drove back. He was making a delivery to a shop on the western side of the state, and the route passed within 12 miles of Garrett and Sons. He took the detour without deliberating. The yard was closed, a lock on the gate, a county notice posted at the fence corner. The sign was still there, hand-painted and slightly faded, the letters worn to a pale version of what they had once been. The lot behind the fence was empty. Mason stood at the gate for several minutes, looking in at nothing in particular, thinking about Wyatt Garrett and whether the old man had gotten what he needed from the sale. He hoped so. He did not think about Jackson Hale or the 14th floor, or the precise weight of those 90 seconds of silence. Those things had found their place, and he had placed them there, and they no longer required his attention. What he thought about, standing at a chain-link fence on a flat Ohio afternoon, was his father, the man who had spent 30 years in a Detroit garage listening to what broken machines were trying to say. He thought about one specific evening when he had been perhaps 12 years old, sitting on an overturned bucket watching his father work. His father had stopped in the middle of a job and listened to the engine run for a long time, without touching it. Then he had said, without looking up, "You do not need to see what is beautiful. You need to hear what something wants." Mason had not understood it then. He was not sure he had understood it for most of his adult life. He understood it now. He drove home after dark and went into the kitchen and stood in front of the paper still taped to the wall above the window, the paper with the 2 words circled in black marker, the paper he had put there 6 months ago because he needed to see it every morning. He stood looking at it for a while, then he reached up and peeled it from the wall. He folded it once, then twice, and put it in the shallow drawer beneath the kitchen counter, next to the contract from Garrett and Sons, his father's old service notes for a 1972 Chevrolet, and the business card Wyatt Garrett had pressed into his hand the morning they signed. He did not need to see those things every day anymore, but he was not ready to lose them either. The following morning was a Saturday, which meant Logan was already at the yard when Mason arrived. The radio playing something low and familiar, the shed smelling the way it always smelled, oil and coffee and cold air and the particular patience of machines waiting to be understood. Mason took his jacket from the hook, pulled on his gloves, picked up his tools, and got to work. Logan looked up from the engine block he was dismantling and asked, without turning around, whether Mason had any regrets. Mason thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything, without performance, without a predetermined answer. Then he said he wished he had bought 51. Logan laughed. And for the first time in longer than either of them would have been able to say exactly, Mason laughed too, not the measured expression of a man managing his circumstances, but the real thing, unguarded and brief. The kind that costs nothing and means more than most people realize. They went back to work.